In my last video, the rather silly named Rorke's Drift Reads Like Bad Fanfiction, I went through some of the raw figures surrounding that remarkable British victory in order to better demonstrate to everyone just how staggering an idea it is that it should have been anything remotely close to a victory at all, at least when you're looking at the broad picture without really paying any mind to the particular circumstances. Indeed, if you watched that video, then you saw how it's nearly impossible to even imagine, no matter what insane and ridiculous figures we posed, how it could be possible. Again, it may be a silly title, but it really can seem sometimes like the Battle of Rorke's Drift is more like a bad historical fantasy than it is reality. But, of course, we all know that there is far more to military history than troop counts and weapons systems. Having demonstrated how impossible seeming their situation is at a cursory glance, I'd now like to get deeper into those little details and talk about how on earth the British somehow managed to win the Battle of Rorke's Drift. Rorke's Drift was a small mission station in the British colony of Natal, just on the border with the Zulu kingdom. Before their invasion, the British Army encamped there and converted its two small buildings into a field hospital and a supply depot. Before the army marched off, a small garrison was left behind to watch over this strategically important site. Of course, the invasion wouldn't get too far, as the force being all but annihilated at Isandlwana, just a few miles away across the border. It was towards the end of that battle that a detachment of Zulu would break off from their main army with orders to position themselves on the border and cut off British lines of communication and retreat. Of course, they end up doing a little bit more than that and end up attacking the British position at Rorke's Drift as well. Now, that battle would start at around 4:30 p.m. on the same day as Isandlwana and carry on until just the early hours of the next morning. Now, this Zulu unit was a reserve unit, which didn't really see any real combat at Isandlwana itself, and they fell under the command of Prince Dabulamanzi, the half-brother of the Zulu king Katsweyo. Now, in the popular film Zulu, 1964, the only real portrayal that we see of a Zulu command structure is this mysterious line of old men who seem to be directing the course of the battle from atop a distant hill. But in reality, actually, Dabulamanzi was pretty young. He was in his early 40s, at least, compared with what we see in the movie. And is viewed by some as being overly aggressive, even rash as a commander. So as the Zulu force is moving into position here, they actually lose a number of their soldiers. It wasn't supposed to happen, but a number of them are actually splitting off from their main body, and they begin launching a series of unplanned raids across the countryside, local African kraals and whatnot. In fact, it may be worthwhile to note that while the film is portraying Rorke's Drift's missionary, Otto Witt, as being forced away from the post by the army in a drunken state, in reality, the man had actually been working with the British garrison there and basically served as a lookout before the battle began. He was cooperating with them very well, and he did this so alongside an army chaplain, incidentally. Once that they spotted the Zulu, only a few minutes march away from their post, Witt did leave the scene, but that was to look after his family, who were alone on a separate farmstead. Given the situation that the Zulu soldiers were actively raiding the countryside, well, I don't think we can really blame him for abandoning them or anything like that. So rather a mark against the film that they portray him in such a negative way, but that's besides the point. In any case, the first and probably most important factor of the British victory here is that when Dabulamanzi ends up launching this little raid of his own, that is, the attack on Rorke's Drift, a little raid, quote-unquote, he's doing so against orders. He's being rash again. In fact, the Zulu were under express orders by King Katsweyo to only ever act defensively. They're not supposed to cross the border into British territory at all. Now, why would that be? If they had just won a major victory, why not press home the advantage? Follow it up with a series of larger, more planned-out raids and attacks on British positions. Maybe even start marching to Natal itself. At the very least, why not just pop over across the border, snatch up a supply depot? It seems so poorly defended, why not do it? For a prince looking to prove himself, to just sit there on the border with 3,000 to 4,000 warriors, all of whom haven't even really fought yet, and they're all presumably eager for action, well, that just seems like a massive waste, doesn't it? You're not going to win much glory just sitting there and intercepting British communications and cutting off retreats. That's not glorious. Well, in the shorter term, in the tactical sense, it does make sense to pop over and, see if you can seize that objective, carry on with the initiative. Right now, Rorke's Drift is ill-defended, but it sits on an important strategic site at a river crossing and was obviously just used by the invaders as a launching off point. If you can dart in, quickly take control of it before it can be reinforced further, you could save yourself a lot of trouble in the future and win that bit of glory besides. So that's what this reserve force does. They attempt to seize the initiative and adapt to a changing situation on the ground. And normally, that is exactly the kind of thing that is lauded in military circles. But here comes that nasty word again, context. The Zulu are not just fighting Natal, now are they? No, no, no. The British Empire is a global power with infinitely more wealth and prestige and military might than the Zulu could even dream of. If King Cetshwayo is going to have any hope of coming out of this war with any semblance of Zulu independence, the conflict needs to stay regional. It needs to stay limited to, just the colony of Natal and the Zulu kingdom. If Cetshwayo can prove to the British that he isn't an easy conquest, and that the war would be more trouble to the British than Zululand is actually worth, then he might be able to bring them to a negotiated peace settlement. Think in terms of, for example, the Anglo-Boer Wars. The first Boer War saw this tiny little Boer force defeat what was, in the grand scheme of things, a pretty small British garrison force, and actually managed to bring the British to talks where they achieved exactly what Cetshwayo is probably hoping for here, a negotiated settlement with at least partial independence. Now, had the British Empire rallied to the flag and decided that no, those terms sought by the Boers are unacceptable, and at no price must the war be lost, well, then they probably could have won it. It might have cost them an unreasonable, even extraordinary amount of wealth and blood, but all the same, they could have done so if only the will was there. The will was there in the Second Boer War. The British had been shown up earlier, and the discovery of diamonds in South Africa certainly didn't help the situation for the Boers either. The Second Boer War, in very stark contrast to the first, would last some 2.5 years and see well over 50,000 dead by its end. Sometimes a war, a conflict, can become so massive in scale that it becomes a beast unconquerable even by the states which are waging it. And when you've lost thousands of your brave lads in valiant and heroic last stands, would you dare to betray their sacrifice by allowing the enemy to negotiate with you? We've already spent so much money and so many lives. Well, if we enter a negotiated settlement, it would be a waste now, wouldn't it? We may as well keep going to the end. And then we have the eternal war. This is an exceptionally dangerous and delicate game to play, especially when, as Cetshwayo is, you are fighting a democratic nation where foreign policy is often subject to public opinion. He may be defending himself, but imagine if Cetshwayo follows up the success at Isandlwana with a counter-invasion. Imagine the headlines of London newspapers reading, "Army of savages looting along the road to Natal after Isandlwana massacre." I doubt that the newspaper's going to say, yeah, but actually, we're attacking them and they're literally just defending themselves and they're not doing anything to us that we wouldn't do to them, so maybe it's a bit even. No! It's going to read massacre at Isandlwana, murder at mission station of Rorke's Drift. That's not a good look. That would be the death knell of the Zulu kingdom. The British would certainly never take it sitting down. They would redouble their efforts, send reinforcements, and burn Zululand to the ground in reprisal. And incidentally, that's exactly what they did do, actually. Maybe the defeat at Isandlwana was a little too crushing. It was too disastrous, too public. for the British to ever do anything else. If it had been, say, a moderate defeat, forcing the British to reposition, recalculate their plan, redraw the lines, but without it being all too massively shameful, well then maybe that peace settlement might have been possible. Again, look at, say, the First Boer War. But in any case, I'm beginning to dwell a little bit too long here. The point is that Katsueyo is trying to thread a very narrow needle. Stay on the defensive, prove a thorn in the conqueror's side, and wear down any Britons that dare to impede on your sovereignty, i.e., don't die while you're praying that eventually either British officials or public opinion decide that it's all just not worth it anymore. Then, and only then, you might have a chance at keeping your power against a vastly superior foe. So yes, while tactically on the small scale, it might look like it makes a lot of sense for Prince Dabulamanzi to seize that initiative and take Rorke's Drift. On the diplomatic level, it's one of the worst things you could try to do. Imagine again if after Isandlwana, yet another headline reads that Zulu forces captured a mission station which had been converted into a hospital and slaughtered its tiny garrison, especially after those few plucky lads of the brave 24th refused to give it up, fighting to the last man as they defended their sick comrades from Zulu spears as blackened smoke filled the skies and all this other nonsense, silly things that the newspapers can do to flare things up. Or you might say, in fact, that the army doesn't much like more than one disaster in a day. Looks bad in the papers, and upsets civilians at their breakfast. And of course, when a civilian is upset at their breakfast, they might contact their, well, not really like this, but they might contact their MP, and the MP might give a nice speech, and all of a sudden, you have a massive new army heading to Zululand with vengeance on the mind. Colonial and imperial politics can be a fickle thing. So, now I'd like to move on and talk a little bit more about some of the more exciting elements of what made the British victory possible. Because while on the diplomatic level, that may be one of the most important things in the grander scheme, and you'll see its importance as well much more strongly, I think, by the end of all this, it is still only a part of the story. It certainly doesn't explain why the British garrison didn't just fold after the initial Zulu assault, but instead survived long enough for that diplomatic factor to play a role in their survival at all. But before we get to all of that, of course, another quick word regarding the brilliant, wonderful, and beautiful people who support me and my work on Patreon.com. Did you know that if only 0.5% of all of my subscribers became my patrons, that I wouldn't rely on advertising revenue or YouTube monetization at all? And did you know that you can join that illustrious and prestigious group of individuals who made this video possible for an entire year, incidentally, for as little as $10? That's $10 for the entire year. I mean, not per month, for the entire year. And that membership includes so much more than just the warm, fuzzy feeling of keeping this channel afloat, but that it also gives you 25% off all of my merchandise items on the Teespring store. It gives you your name in the credits of all my videos and access to those videos a full week earlier than the common viewer. And did you know that you get to join us for patron-exclusive live streams every other week? We're having a Hearts of Iron 4 tournament this week, or next week, really. Rather, it'll be this week by the time you're seeing the video. It'll be last week, or more, it'll be this week when all the patrons are watching because they get to watch it earlier. You get what I'm talking about. In any case, I imagine you did all know all this because I actually mentioned it in the last video, and I will probably be hitting you over the head with it an awful lot more in the future because it's proven pretty profitable to do so. Anyways, thank you to those who do decide to join that most noble corps of officers at any level, for you are the people who make my work possible. And now, at last, back to the subject at hand. I apologize for the advert. In any case, in the last video, when we looked at the numbers to demonstrate just how big this numerical discrepancy was, we did so purposefully without a lot of the context. Again, that video was solely designed to show just how uneven the battle was at its most core level. For the new, student of British history, looking at the Battle of Rorke's Drift summary on Wikipedia, they're like, wow, 153, that's intense. The initial perception is a one of utter impossibility. That's what we were talking about in that last video. But when the Zulu soldiers charged the British in real life, they weren't in a vast open field. Let's talk about fortifications, and how dramatically they can change the odds of battle even when you're outnumbered 20-1. When the decision was made to stand and fight against the Zulu rather than risk a retreat, the British immediately began to fortify Rorke's Drift to the best of their ability. The storehouse and hospital were built up as natural strong points in the perimeter. Furniture was used to barricade any outside-facing doorways, and small loopholes were cut into the walls for the soldiers to fire out of from a form of relative safety inside the building. Then, for the space in between those buildings, mealie bags were used to build up a wall alongside a small stone wall that was already present, part of an animal pen. Again, it's called a kraal. I'm probably mispronouncing it. It's an Afrikaans word, I think. Whatever. A kraal. Now, something that we don't often see portrayed is actually the height of these fortifications, the scale, the significance of them, so to say. At least in some of the areas, the walls the British built up were too high to be all that easily scaled by the Zulu. They weren't just these like little waist-high or chest-high little inconveniences. The Zulu couldn't just jump over them or take like a quick step up and then you're inside the fort. So when that wall washes over, that wave of Zulu washes over, it's not like they're just going to go boop, and all of a sudden they're inside the fort stabbing away at people. And that'll become very important in just a short time. It's a pretty significantly sized wall. It's also worthy to note that when this decision was first made to stand and fight, Lieutenant Chard actually had far more than just his final 150 with which to do that fighting. There were actually some 400 men to defend Rorke's Drift, a pretty significant number of them coming from the Natal native Carabiners. However, these men had already seen fighting at Isandlwana. They were running low on ammunition themselves, and odds are that they could, or at least they thought, they could see the writing on the wall. And so after they buy the garrison a little bit of time by skirmishing with the approaching Zulu just outside of Rorke's Drift, they did ultimately abandon the post. In fact, the garrison was a bit upset at losing this invaluable and genuinely life-saving resource of these couple hundred guys, and a few shots were actually fired by the garrison in anger at the fleeing men. It actually wound up killing one of their corporals, a certain Mr. William Anderson. It wasn't quite so polite as we might otherwise like to think. And with his numbers so dramatically reduced, Lieutenant Chard would need to change up the plan a little bit. An interior wall then, made of all things out of biscuit tins, was built from the storehouse and opposite the stone kraal in order to basically build a little citadel within the original fortifications. Of course, by biscuit tins, I do mean rather, significantly sized crates, so it's not like these, little boxes that could just be knocked over like a grocery store display or something. This is effectively making the defenses of Rorke's Drift a modular setup, so that if any one part of the mission happens to fall to the enemy, the other elements could continue to make a fighting stand and support areas that are in distress, as it were. And again, that would become one of the most important, one of the most significant elements in how the British actually survived all of this. What all of this represents is effectively a dramatic force multiplier, so that this tiny 150 garrison can project a much greater amount of force. They are taking what starts out as an utterly mathematically impossible odds, which is what we saw in the last video. At its base, core level, the mathematics literally just cannot work out. And what they're doing is they're doing everything within their power to balance out those figures as much as possible. In a gaming sense, you might say they're adding as many positive modifiers to their dice roll as they can possibly get. They're min-maxing it, so to say. Anyways, at long last, let's look at the actual battle proper now. The Zulu forces arrive at Rorke's Drift around 4:30 p.m. This is after they'd been marching already for some 8.5 hours, having started out at 8 a.m. that morning. They would spend the next 8.5 hours launching assaults on the British fortifications and then keep on skirmishing with rifles for another 4 hours after that, to where the field would only fall quiet at around 4 a.m. the next day. And of course, one more thing to note, for whatever it's worth, these are, again, reserve troops. These men aren't all, fit young men in their prime, but the average age of many of these Zulu warriors is actually in their 40s and 50s. So, in any case, battle is begun, and 600 Zulu warriors take off at the charge against the British South Wall. Wait, 600? Only 600? What happened to like the 3,000 to 4,000 strong horde that was going to wash over the walls and everything? Well, just because you have a very large total doesn't mean that all of those soldiers can or should be sent in one massive attack wave. It takes time for such a large force to arrive to battle, to say nothing of the time it would take them all to deploy, especially if the Zulu were to try and get a full encirclement while keeping at a good enough range to avoid being fired upon the whole time while they're doing so. You know, if they have to like try and, we're going to try and encircle this building, right? Well, you guys have to go all the way around there to make sure that the enemy can't see you while we're doing the encirclement. And while you're spending all this time, marching to the field, 4,000 guys, that takes up a lot of space on a march. You're taking time to arrive to the field, deploy yourselves to get ready for the attack and everything. You're losing, during all that time, you're losing that most critical of military resources, initiative. You're allowing more time for your enemy to observe your movements, to take stock of your forces and determine what your plan is, and as such, prepare the perfect counter. And again, it's also important to note that with such a large force, you wouldn't expect all of them to be arriving to the battlefield at once. Very rarely do forces move in singular large blocks, especially when the intention of that force, as is the case here, is to pursue a retreating enemy who will certainly not be so polite as to keep in their own nice and neatly ordered blocks together for you. And as well, of course, to block off roads of communication, where it would be, again, conducive to maybe split the force off into at least a few different little groups. And again, you also have to remember that elements of this Zulu force were even splitting off from the main force without orders and going off to raid local civilians. Rather, individual battalions or regiments, or as the Zulu would call them, individual ibuthos, probably horrible pronunciation, I apologize for, but apparently impi actually doesn't mean regiment in Zulu, it just means war, and instead, it was like a more European introduction that they Zulu called their guys impi, but it's all a group of impi something, because it's war or something, war band or whatever, but in fact an individual regiment or battalion is an ibutho. Anyways, individual ibuthos are arriving to the field at different times according to their march speed, the route of the march, things like that. So again, you could just arrive on the site, kind of look at the enemy and wave, hi guys, we'll kill you soon, don't worry. Or, of course, when you arrive to the field, you can take the initiative, move in to press and harry the enemy. If a vanguard meets the foe, that's what they're supposed to do generally. You skirmish with them, you keep them in the same position, prevent them from having any rest or maneuvering too much, and then you're waiting for the remainder of your guys to all pour in to really win the day. It's also the case that even if you do have your entire force collected and able to assault the enemy in one go, you never want to actually do that. You never want to have a full force all-out attack at the same time. You always need to keep a healthy force in reserve. So sure, the Zulu may have 4,000 men ready to fight, but even if they were all in position at the same time, definitely doesn't mean you want them all to take off at the charge in one go, like what we had happening in that first video, as if it was just 3,000 versus 150, and then go get them. Because if you do that, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if one of your flanks falters and begins to fall back? The standing troops would suddenly become vulnerable to being outflanked. And that's one of the many reasons why you want to keep reserves, to reinforce those flanks should something go wrong. Like, we have a whole line, these guys are faltering, send in more to make that stronger, to bulk up that section of the line. Similarly, of course, they say that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. Battlefield situations change and shift, and individuals on the ground are reacting to those changes in real time with inherently limited information. If you've committed your entire force to a singular battle plan, but then something goes awry, Well, suddenly you don't have anyone to send in to help correct the issue with fresh orders more appropriate to the changed scenario, but instead you're going to be left trying desperately to send orders into men who are already engaged and are either unable to carry out your previous orders, are unwilling to do so, or perhaps worst of all, they're dogmatically fulfilling those orders and they're dying as a result because, again, their orders are no longer relevant to a changed situation. If men are in the field, fighting each other, it's very difficult sometimes to get fresh orders to them. Rather, if something happens to them in the field, like, oh no, they're being encircled because we didn't realize that the enemy had their own reserves and they pushed in at a weaker, point in our line and now they're going around, Well, how very convenient. We have our own reserves we can send in to prevent the encirclement rather than sending a runner over to those guys in the line and be like, hey, you're getting surrounded, back up. Things get, a little impractical there pretty quickly. So anyways, even if you have a force of 3,000 to 4,000 guys ready to go, you never use them all at once. You send in a part of the force, you probe the enemy, see how they respond, see where their weaknesses are, and how you might exploit those weaknesses. Then, of course, depending on what happens to that initial wave, you can either pull them back entirely, accept the loss, or you can send in various reserves and second waves to play on the changing situation with the new information you receive. And what's more, if you do decide to go for that single large wave assault because you're just so assured that nothing could possibly go wrong and that you will just wash over the enemy defenses, so just send them all out at the same time. Well, what happens again if say one element of that army decides to retreat, whether that decision is really warranted or not? Maybe the junior officer in command is just not really that smart a guy. Maybe he sees something that kind of throws him off, makes him think that something has changed. Maybe they misinterpret the orders. Anything could happen. But say that one element of the army decides to pull back a little bit. Something like that could very easily cause a general rout, because if, officer number 2 looks over to officer 1 and sees, well, hold on, he's not doing what he's supposed to do. If he's not doing what he's supposed to do, I can't do what I'm supposed to do. I'm out. I don't want to die. He pulls back himself. Then officer number 3 looks over at that like, oh, okay, we're all retreating. Boys, hightail it. Something must have gone horribly wrong over there. Everyone run for your lives. It's very easy. If panic decides to set in even one tiny part of an army, it can very rapidly, if things lose control, race throughout those ranks and create a general rout. Especially if there's no help to arrive from reinforcements to those weakened positions. If there's no forces there to force their fellows back into the fight at gunpoint or to reassure them with fresh orders or anything like that. Not only is a rout going to be when armies always suffer their worst casualties, but it also opens them up to an organized counterattack. The entire force risks losing cohesion, taking to the hills, and being mopped up piecemeal by what would otherwise be an inferior force. If all those Zulu take off running and then something goes wrong and they all end up retreating away, then what's to prevent the British from, either making an escape or pushing out or doing any number of things and picking off those smaller Zulu forces as they are, not united in their one larger army and all that. Once again, this introduction of further context, further reality beyond the approach of take two armies and mash together, the sort of thing that we see in movies all the time, it all adds a layer of complexity for the Zulu, which is greatly favoring British odds. So, 600 Zulu, not 3,000, but 600, moved to attack Rorke's Drift, charging the south wall. But along the way there isn't all too much in the way of cover, and as I said in my last video, the British begin opening fire at 500 yards. And that's quite a distance to run when you are under fire. And again, this plan doesn't necessarily survive first contact with the enemy, and somewhere along that charge, the force ends up fragmenting and splitting. Some of the Zulu become pinned down under the withering fire and are forced to go to ground, their advance crippled. Meanwhile, those men who do carry on the charge realize that they're running up against a nearly impossible situation in front of them. The fortified storehouse is to their right, and directly in front of them is another strong point, the hospital. And between the two of them, you have a tall wall with musketmen lining the way. If they push to the hospital, the doors will certainly be barred, and the hundreds of men will become log-jammed against its walls as they try to force their way in and climb through windows or to the roof, during which they can be stabbed and gunned down one by one. Not only that, of course, but plenty of soldiers are inside that hospital firing outside of it through the loopholes, all the while the storehouse and the wall over to the right are able to reinforce that strong point. If the Zulu instead decide to push into the storehouse, well, they'll face the exact same problem. And if they carry on through the center, attempting to overtake the walls directly, well, then they're caught between both strong points at once, and even if they should force their way through or over those walls, most surely another volley will be waiting for them inside the walls. No. You can see how this entire position is untenable. And so, from one individual or another, a decision on that charge is made. It's made on the spot, adapting and shifting to the circumstances as they present themselves on the ground. If you can't go straight on, you can't stop the charge lest you get pinned down like so many of the Zulu already have been back there, well then, try to go around. Moving to the left, the Zulu sweep around the hospital and begin to attack along the northern wall, while some of them do try to force their way inside the building. They sort of, the entire charge is progressing along and sort of shifts around and is attacking all along the way as they do so. But this entire time, as the forces is shifting direction and probing and attacking at different angles along the way, they're being fired on the entire time. Along this whole way, some of these Zulu run. Others are pinned down, like in the back and whatnot. Others stop to try and force their way into the hospital, while others still are sweeping further and further around to the other side of the fortifications to attack the northwestern and the northern walls. The Zulu haven't even engaged in significant hand-to-hand combat, and we already see the force being whittled down into smaller bits, piece by piece. By the time the Zulu reach the northern wall, they are a fraction of the total force size. And then, of course, for those few Zulu who do manage to get stuck into melee combat, they find that in most places, the walls are too tall to reliably scale. So unable to reach the top, they end up clambering underneath its base and attempting to fire their weapons at close range. They're attempting to grab at enemy rifles as they're poking over and through loopholes and such, and they're trying to stab through those loopholes to get anyone they can reach. As some men do make it over the wall, of course, in some areas it's a bit lower down probably, some areas will be damaged, and some areas some guys are better at, clambering over than others. Well then, of course, they're standing on the melee bags, they're entirely exposed to British fire all around them, and of course to bayonets. And if in this or in any of the assaults, the Zulu do manage to force a gap in the defenses, with good numbers, like a couple of guys manage to break through, well, still, there will be yet another defensive line just behind it. The biscuit tins and whatnot, we have multiple levels of defense. This is the value of planning and fortification. They are force multipliers for the British in this scenario. The Zulu may have dramatic numbers, but they can't reliably use them all at once, and for every force they do send out, the forces are immediately divided up, thinned out by gunfire, by fortified strongpoints, and by a modular defense. Meanwhile, the British, for their part, have their backs to the walls. They're fighting desperately, and they are condensed in a small and highly defensible position, able to reinforce each other far more reliably than the Zulu can, running across those wide open fields. So that's just the first assault, but the same basic pattern would carry on over hours and hours over numerous waves. And each and every time the Zulu launch one of those attack waves, trying from different perspectives, different angles, different little tricks here and there, but all ultimately ending in the same way, they're losing men, they're losing blood, and they're losing steam. All the same, of course, the Zulus still have plenty of advantages up their sleeve. And while the British may not be losing all too many men when compared to the Zulu, they can't really afford to lose any at all, whereas the Zulu have people to spare, as grim a sentiment as that may be. And to the credit of the Zulu, because they aren't committing their entire army in this singular massive attack wave that then fails and you have this massive gap in between where nothing's happening, they're splitting up their force into smaller units. They are able to keep up near continuous smaller assaults on the British line, alongside, of course, having men pepper away at the mission station with musketry that had been taken off the British dead at Isandlwana. They're preventing the British from engaging in repairs to their defensive works. They're preventing the British from resting and preparing for the next assault. In short, the Zulu may not be able to outright take the British position, as they probably initially hoped they might be able to, but they are wearing it down. By 6 p.m., the hospital and the northern wall have to be evacuated because it's just untenable to hold them, as the British are forced to condense their defensive perimeter. And by 10 p.m., the stone kraal is evacuated as well, meaning that the British are holed up in this one final bastion. There's nowhere left to run. After that point, the Zulu would continue launching waves of attack until around midnight, after which point they would continue skirmishing with the British through to 4 a.m. By the time the next morning comes, the British are in a bad, bad way. They are tired, they are reduced, their defenses are a shell of what they once were, and they are immensely low on ammunition. We're talking like a few hundred rounds here out of the initial 20,000 plus. This is a close-run thing, and the Zulu, if they were only to charge, once or twice more, it's doubtful whether the British could stand them again. This debate, I'm sure it can be debated and whatnot, but at least the broad, cultural consensus these days is that, if the Zulu had charged one last time, they would have taken the garrison. It would have been over, and I think that there's at least a solid enough point to where it could be argued that that would be the case. Now, if you've watched the movie Zulu, you'll know that it was in the very early morning that the next day that the Zulu do make one final appearance. Hundreds, thousands of them even, once more line the horizon as if to make that one final assault and finally crack the garrison and destroy the defense and whatnot. And you'll also know from the film that they don't do this. However, you may not know the reason why, because I'm afraid it isn't anywhere near so honorable or conciliatory as portrayed in the film. The British, as doesn't really need to be repeated again, are in a god-awful state of affairs. But what about the Zulu? Well, these men, many in their 40s and 50s, had in the past 24 hours marched for some 8.5 hours, only to spend their next 8.5 hours launching a series of attacks on the British position and spending another 4 hours after that in skirmishing. They were exhausted, and they were hungry, as there hadn't been ample provision for supplies for days prior to this point, because, they were marching on campaign, and this wasn't an anticipated assault. This is an unplanned raid, and they're in the middle of foreign territory. They had suffered over 350 killed and many more wounded. They had no way of knowing the precise situation of the British in terms of remaining ammunition and whatnot, and what's more is that reinforcements were already on the way. A relief column under Lord Chelmsford would arrive at Rorke's Drift by 8 a.m., yet the Zulu could probably expect very little, if any, aid whatsoever, because they aren't even supposed to be there. Again, after all this, remember what was being fought and sacrificed for ultimately was against the express wishes of the Zulu king. It was all of it to the detriment of the Zulu, victory or defeat. Prince Bulamanzi would already have a lot of explaining to do, even if he had won the Battle of Rorke's Drift on that initial front charge of 600. To say nothing of this needless level of loss of blood and public relations is a good way to phrase it. Really, honestly, it's a good thing for Bulamanzi that King Katsueyo was family. Probably saved him a good deal of stress in the end. So it isn't all too terribly surprising that the Zulu decide now to cut their losses and retreat. Even if, now with hindsight, we could see that they probably could have won with one last charge, if only that charge, had a fraction of the courage and the zeal of their first however many. But even then, if they had carried on that one final charge, it still would have been ultimately a bad move for the Zulu. Even starting this attack at all was a bad move, and odds are that as the corpses are piling all around Bulamanzi from those repeated failed attempts to take the position, brash as he may have been, he's probably beginning to realize that this was a bad idea. Regardless of whether he could have won it or not, he shouldn't have been there to begin with. That no matter how extraordinary the raw numbers were, Prince Bulamanzi's looking at the figures, there's only 100 of them, there's 3,000 of us, easy, we'll do it, easy, mop-up operation. No matter how extraordinary those raw numbers are, and no matter how unbelievable it is at first glance that the British could possibly win that battle, truly, once you add in the appropriate context behind it, and once you understand the diplomatic situation and the details and niceties of the battle itself, you begin to realize that indeed, yes, the Battle of Rorke's Drift was certain from the start. But whether in the long or the short term, that certainty was never in favor of the Zulu kingdom. Now, thank you all so very much for watching. Of course, most particularly to my ever-beneficent supporting classes on Patreon.com, for it is by virtue of that membership and their generosity that I am able to carry on with my work. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.